Like many men of my generation, I was raised on war stories. Many a Sunday afternoon of my childhood and adolescence was spent in front of the box, watching true life tales such as the Battle of Britain, Reach for the Sky, Sink the Bismarck and the Dam Busters, as well as works of fiction like The Cruel Sea and The Guns of Navarone. Tales of heroism, loss and self-sacrifice. But also, it must be said, tales of victory. But that victory was often played down, instead quite correctly highlighting the real human cost of war. At the end of the Dam Busters, Wing Commander Guy Gibson, who had led the raid that had destroyed two vital dams and paralysed large parts of German war industry, was asked if he was going to the mess for a drink after the raid. He refuses, as he says his last line of the film, "No, I have 57 letters to write." Even as a young boy, I knew what that meant, and it was a perfect end to what had been, for most of the story, a celebration of the creative ingenuity of wartime Britain, led by the eccentric architect of the raid, the brilliant Barnes Wallis. That final line cuts any triumphalism stone dead. And that has been the spirit of remembering our war dead since at least the end of the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars that didn't. Not the victory, but the loss, the sacrifice, and sometimes the folly which can be described as something that is even harder to bear, the waste. And that has always been one of the most compelling things about the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Day, as well as its more flexible and convenient cousin, Remembrance Sunday. It made you think about the dead. During that surprisingly drawn out 120 seconds, during which there is nothing else to do other than to imagine what it might be like to be facing your certain death. Not ever having served in the military, much less ever having experienced being in a situation where other human beings are actually trying to kill me, I can only guess at what that might have felt like. The war films helped, just a little, but probably only a little, since old soldiers, the ones who have seen combat, are notoriously tight-lipped in sharing their stories with civilians, believing them, not without reason, to be incapable of understanding. My veneration of all those that have served in combat only started to coalesce after the mild rebellion of my teenage years, and I started to attend the remembrance services, and it has been a constant every November since. Over the course of my life, I have noticed an increase in the observation of the 2-minute silence, often from businesses and institutions, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. Perhaps it increased after the Falklands conflict, all the way back in '82, but previous to that, it wasn't something that was really on my radar. I was only 14 at the time, so my memory is unreliable on this, but up until then I had never seen a total observation of the 2-minute silence, of the kind that my dad had described to me. According to him, trains stopped, buses stopped, traffic stopped. People stopped dead in the street and observed it where they stood. I had even heard apocryphal stories that criminals, and the police attempting to apprehend them, stopped in mid-pursuit, only for the chase to resume again in earnest at 11:02. Now, I'm not old enough to remember that, but I can imagine that after something as catastrophic and wasteful as the First World War, it would have been remembered with the requisite solemnity. And once again, as the nation was delivered victorious after nearly succumbing in 1940, it doesn't seem unlikely that the population would give genuine thanks for the sacrifices made. And it wouldn't have been a sacrifice that existed only in concept, as it has been for me, having known nothing except 54 years of peace and relative prosperity. Those people in the 40s, 50s and 60s would have known precisely what the sacrifices were made for and what they stood to lose if they faltered, as well as what it cost them to fight. By the late 60s, however, as they began to swing in the summer of love, things began to change. Memories began to fade, and younger people, the baby boomers, had never known war, or at least the kind of total war that Britain went through from 1939 to 45. And as the memories faded, so did the respect. Some of that was a healthy lightening up of attitudes. After all, society should not live in the past, no matter how glorious. Some of this levity was expressed in gentle mocking of the military and the attendant mindset, with Monty Python's military fairies and the pin-sharp satire of Peter Cook's futile gesture. And some of it was funny, really funny. But there was also some revisionism. Dickie Attenborough's comedy musical Oh What a Lovely War came out in 1969, focusing ostensibly on British generals' reckless disregard of their soldiers' lives when prosecuting the war, but was also an iconoclastic piece hoping to tear down stuffy and pompous British society and remake it in their own progressive image. 52 years later, and under the cover of COVID, they're in sight of the finishing line. Now, I don't know why the phenomenon of Remembrance Day has had such a resurgence in the last few years. Maybe it was the messy but justified conflict in Afghanistan and the messy, unjustified war in Iraq, in which the lions seemed once again to be directed into battle by the donkeys, this time from Whitehall. Maybe it was the centenary of the beginning of the First World War, and then the centenary of the armistice at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 2018. But it is something that has become more prominent of late. So prominent, in fact, that politicians vie to be the first to wear their poppies and signalling their remembrance virtue by wearing them from mid-October. The convention, but not a rule, is that they should be worn from November the 1st to the 11th and discarded by the 12th, or until after Remembrance Sunday, whichever comes last. But it is curious that this most solemn expression of patriotism is the one thing that even the most anti-British media types won't disrespect. They, of course, will argue that it is not about patriotism, and they will be partly right. It is what it is, a symbol of remembrance. Remembrance of lives lost in service of something bigger than themselves. And that bigger something was, in large part, their country. So it is about patriotism, even if it may also be about other things. But my guess is that, in much the same way that Samuel Johnson opined patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, maybe they feel the wearing of a poppy, that one sacred expression of patriotism, gives those media scoundrels license to portray their own country with every subsequent utterance. Poppy wearing is the last refuge of a modern lefty media scoundrel. So we wear a poppy to remember those who sacrificed themselves, theoretically, for us. And that is only right and proper. So right and proper that even wankers like James O'Brien wear them. But I would argue, in a fairly indistinct way, that we remember that those men that fought and died did so not just for us, but for certain values. Now, I'm not on sound foundations here because I cannot divine why precisely those men thought it worth it to put their lives on the line for this country and against that country. And I'm thinking specifically about the Second rather than the First World War here. But they must have thought that there was something about our country that was worth defending, that they imagined wasn't present, but should be, in their country. The full extent of the persecution of the Jews wasn't revealed until at least the final months of the war, so it can't have been that. Nor could it have been the medical experiments formed on concentration camp inmates. It was more likely something nebulous like self-determination, or even national autonomy. Now, these don't really feel as if they are particularly glorious impulses worth risking one's life for, at least when articulated in such prosaic language. But such language does obscure the deeper rationale as to why those men felt it worth it to risk everything. We like to think of ourselves as particularly well informed, mostly because of the sheer amount of information that is available to us. But as been so vividly highlighted by this whole COVID madness, more information doesn't make us more intelligent or even any better informed. In fact, it might even make us less so. So I think we can discard the notion advanced by some that the population of Britain in the late 1930s were an ignorant bunch, at least no more so than we are. They understood the world they lived in, and they understood right from wrong. And although, as I say, they can't especially have known about the magnitude of the persecution of the Jews and others, there would have been enough noise coming out of Germany, demonstrated most obviously by the Kindertransport, for most people to intuit that this was a regime that was not to be trusted. The sacrifice of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland to appease Hitler and supposedly to prevent war was lauded by the chattering classes of the day who, remembering the horrors of the trenches, treated it as a kind of victory. Chamberlain's quixotic "peace in our time." But many, many others who had just as vivid memories of the Somme and Passchendaele regarded the agreement in Munich as a shameful surrender, both of the Czechs and perhaps more importantly, of principle itself. The most famous of the dissenters was of course Winston Churchill, but he was joined just as vociferously by the socialist leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee. It's no surprise that Attlee was such a successful deputy to Churchill in the war that it inevitably came less than a year later. Now, I know I'm going around the houses here, but that's because I'm trying to get at the nub of the reason for Remembrance Day. Why is it that we remember? On a very shallow level, that of national identity, we do remember that they were our blokes. But that's not really it. What we remember, I think, is that these were men who, quite simply, stood up to bullies. Perhaps we should say it was an impulse rather than a value. And since they are dead, we can acknowledge that they stood up until the point that they could no longer stand. They stood up until their bodies gave out, not their minds, not their hearts, not their consciences, and not their principles. It was their bodies that succumbed, as all human bodies will do, to bullets, bombs and bayonets. And the reason we admire them so is because we can assume that even if they were given 100 lives, they would have sacrificed every one. Why can we assume that? Because they only had one unique, precious and unrepeatable life. And they gave it. They gave that to rid the world of murderous bullies. And now we have the nauseating spectacle of bullies the world over. De Pfeffel Johnson, Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron sombrely laying wreaths, clutching their hands to their breasts and squeezing out crocodile tears whilst they obliterate the freedoms, effectively freedom from murderous bullies, that those countless millions sacrificed everything to give us. The hypocrisy is off the scale. And still people lap it up. Still people insist that Remembrance Day is above the political issues of the day and that we should continue to observe it as we always have. Normally, I would agree with them. But this isn't normal. These aren't normal times. In fact, they are abnormal to the point of insult. And the insult is so great, so shameless in the truest meaning of the word, and so inverted to the true meaning and spirit of remembrance, that for the first time in over 35 years, I can no longer play any part in it. There is only one thing that Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson can do that is actually more insulting than taking a shit on the cenotaph. And that is for him to wear a poppy. And I won't share in the insult.